Hey guys, welcome to the Hypertrophy Hustle Show. So this week I'm speaking to Stephan Guyenet. So this is one that I'm extremely excited for, as he's someone that sort of influenced quite a lot of my thought process. A lot of the time it's stuff that I'm sort of insanely sort of obsessed with, like obesity and sort of everything around that. It's just like, here's a tidal wave of sort of health and everything else in the world. Like if you sort of think about it, like a lot of things seem to be getting better, but then you look at health and we just seem to be in an absolute trap. And one of the things that I think is really important is you go out and you look at sort of the level of information quality that we're sort of seeing nowadays. And anyone can have a mic, anyone can talk on a podcast, anyone can have an Instagram account, anyone can talk about this kind of stuff. And I think that in some ways creates a bit of an issue. But Stephan's done a really cool thing. He's created this company called Red Pen Reviews. And basically what they do is sort of, I'll get him to explain a little bit more, but sort of they'll take a book, they'll sort of examine it, they'll sort of figure out how scientific is this, how rational is this. So Stephan, when you sort of made this company, what was the general idea of this, and what is sort of the goal of this project?
Yeah. So one thing I want to clarify with the use of the word company is that it kind of makes it sound like a for-profit venture, which it isn't. I know you didn't intend that, but I just want to make sure everyone understands. We're currently a registered charity in Washington State, and we're working toward 501c3 nonprofit status. So basically the idea behind this is that a lot of us in the nutrition community are really frustrated with the quality of health and nutrition related information. And we all see this every day. You know, we see claims on social media, we see claims in popular books, particularly people who are more knowledgeable, who have more background and who can more easily pick out the issues. I think often get frustrated with the variable quality of this information, because it's not all bad, right? Some of it's good, some of it's bad, but a lot of it is really profoundly bad. And this is information that people are using to make health decisions. So this is really important stuff. And so, I mean, if you're someone who doesn't have a background in this stuff, how do you sort the wheat from the chaff? Well, it's actually really hard to do. I mean, what are you going to do? Like go and get a PhD in nutrition? If you want to understand whether a book is, has high information quality or low information quality, how do you figure that out if you want to read that book? Do you go to Amazon.com and read reviews? Those reviews are basically useless. I mean, if you look on almost any book, no matter whether it's evidence-based or not, if it's reasonably popular, it's going to have a score of between 4 and 5 stars on Amazon. That's for almost every book that's reasonably popular. So, and you read the reviews and, people, they're not experts. They're not spending time on it. They're not checking facts. They're just kind of knee-jerking about their personal, reactions to it. And so those are basically useless. Reviews in newspapers, book reviews in newspapers, usually written by non-experts, usually someone who does not have expertise in the topic. They write about basically whatever they want to write about, whatever struck their fancy. They're not checking references generally. They're not doing literature reviews to check the factual accuracy of certain claims. And so, sometimes those reviews will express some degree of skepticism, but it's usually not something that's really that well informed, of course, with some exceptions. But in general, I don't think those are very useful either. So basically, we need some way for people to be able to sort the wheat from the chaff. And that's why we that's why we started Red Pen Reviews. And at the core of what we do is a systematic, semi-quantitative review method that gives books quantitative scores on scientific accuracy, reference accuracy, and healthfulness. And it gives quantitative scores, and then those are displayed at the top of the page in easy to digest bars, color-coded bars that let you know what the information quality is of that book. And this method, as far as we are aware, yields the most informative, most consistent, and most unbiased health and nutrition book reviews that you can find anywhere. So you can go on our site, Red Pen Reviews, and it's all available for free. You land on a book review page, and the first thing you see is those percentage bars, the title of the book, the cover image, and those percentage bars. And literally in a few seconds, you can get a decent idea of what the information quality is of that book. then you can go as deep as you want. You can read the summary that tells you more and a little bit about why we scored. And then below that, we have a detailed explanation of the full scoring for that book. Every number that we assign to it, we explain it with click-through references. So it's really a very, you can engage with it at any depth you want. And one of the cool things about it is you can actually, because our review method is systematic, it's the same for every book, you can compare between books. So you could say, hey, what's the best low carb book that they've reviewed so far? Or what's the best book on the microbiome that they've reviewed so far? And you can just look at the overall score we assign it and say, hey, this one looks like the best. I think I'll read that one instead of this other one. So it's really empowering consumers. It's empowering healthcare professionals too, because people are constantly coming to healthcare professionals and saying, hey, have you heard of this book? What do you think about it? And generally they haven't read it. They may not have a well-formed opinion on it. So with, if it's something we've reviewed, just go to Red Pen Reviews and check it out and see. And, literally in like 1 minute, you'll probably have a pretty reasonable opinion of whether it's a good book or not.
I think it's really, it's sort of like we really need this, because it's really hard to tell what's good and what's not. And it's like, you look at any healthcare practitioner and they're given this sort of responsibility, and it's like for them, and like I look at all my classmates, I've been asked I'm sort of known as the like health and nutrition guy in my class. And like, I've been asked some questions where I'm like, wow, like, damn, like I've gotten into arguments with my lecturers about what controls weight loss and gain. Like they haven't sort of believed in sort of calories having really much relevance at all. And I'm just sitting there kind of baffled. And it's sort of like, okay, we need something that sort of demonstrates like this is pretty damn crucial. Like we need information to be like freely accessible and understandable.
Yeah. And like you said earlier, this is an issue that happens with the democratization of information. So now anybody can say anything they want. And that, it's not a bad thing necessarily. And there's some benefits to that. For example, on Twitter, I can interact with top scientists halfway across the world. And that's really cool. Those are people I might not have had access to otherwise, at least not in such a like fluid and regular way. But on the other hand, like everybody with an opinion can broadcast that opinion. If they're a persuasive person, then they can persuade people. And that's not good. And I think in this age of information overload, it becomes really hard to tell the signal from the noise. And I think that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to say, hey, look, we developed this method. This is a method that yields, you can look at exactly what we do. We're completely transparent. And this is a method that yields better conclusions than the methods that are typically used to review books, which is no method. And so, if you want to tell the signal from the noise, come check it out. And the other thing is this, ultimately we're trying to improve the incentive structure of the health and publishing industry, because that's really the problem here is the incentives are screwed up. The incentive in the health and publishing industry is not very strongly aligned with information accuracy. It's aligned with, having a loud voice, getting a platform for yourself, making money either through the book or indirectly, increasing your popularity, public perception. So I think that, and a lot of those incentives, a lot of the main incentives are actually, not only are they not aligned with information accuracy, they're at odds with information accuracy, because the more you like make outrageous claims, or let's say unsupported claims or exaggerated claims, the more attention you're going to get. The more you make novel claims, things people haven't heard before, even if they're poorly supported. You're the guy with this big new idea, plant lectins cause obesity and all disease, or, carbs cause all of Alzheimer's disease and brain diseases, wheat is the thing that gives you a pot belly. Like all these like novel ideas are things that, if you want to stand out from the crowd, you can't say the same thing as everybody else. You can't be like, hey guys, hey, calories matter, by the way. Calories actually impact your body fatness. You're not going to sell any books by saying that. And so I think that, or at least you're not going to sell many. So yeah, so the incentives are misaligned. And so basically we're trying to realign the incentives of the publishing industry with the incentives of information accuracy and public health, ultimately making people better informed so that they can make better decisions about their health and have better health. But also, there's a bigger thing too, is like, or at least a different thing, is increasing, is like restoring public trust in science. I think that we're at a time now where a lot of people just don't really, a lot of people believe that scientists are just full of hot air and they should just listen to some guy who's making loud claims on social media or whatever. And I think that's really eroded, at least in some domains, public trust in science. And so there's a bigger picture here about respecting information accuracy, respecting the research community, not to say that they are always right, but they tend to be more right than internet gurus. And restoring public faith in science. So I think that's kind of what we're trying to accomplish in a verbose nutshell.
I think it's a fantastic mission, because it's kind of like, well, I have conversations with people where they don't, like, if it's just gen pop people, or they're not involved in academia and they kind of don't understand, okay, like, what's the best tool that we have for finding the truth? Probably research. But then people begin to sort of, like, I've had conversations with my lecturers, where they'll say stuff like, you can't really trust science because effectively all scientists are biased. They've all got their agenda. It's just like, okay, then who do we trust? Like, it's sort of, I'm finding in some circles there's a very sort of dislike towards science almost. It's sort of like, well, and then they'll see someone on Instagram who sort of is really convincing they've got this one little claim, and then they say this is what fixes everything, and they've got some anecdotal evidence to back it up. It's like, damn, man, like, it sucks that that's becoming prevalent and becoming like,
yeah, I
easy
mean,
to understand.
the problem is that there's a grain of truth to it. Scientists are biased. They're human beings, and sometimes they're wrong. And there's many ways to be biased. But I think that what you have to examine is, what is the incentive structure inside science? What is the incentive structure outside science? And the incentive structure inside science is not perfectly aligned with finding the truth and being accurate. There are incentives related to funding and related to, industry affiliation. I think the biggest negative incentive is personal career development. People are very focused on that. But I mean, the incentives are way worse outside of science.
It's literally like, okay, how can you convince people to sell more shit? It's like,
yeah, exactly. Inside science, at least there are guardrails. Like, there's peer review. So if you're like saying total nonsense, you're having to get that past some of the most knowledgeable, intelligent people in the world.
Yeah.
You're not going to get funded if you're completely out to lunch. Your lab is going to get shut down, and you're not going to be able to publish anywhere. So, I mean, not to say that any of those incentives structures are perfect, but they are, broadly, roughly aligned with truth seeking. And we see the output of that in terms of progress in biomedical science and in other parts of science. Like, it actually works. We are making forward progress and gaining, usable information. And I think it's not as efficient as it could be if the system were better and the incentives were better. But I don't think it is accurate or useful to just say, oh, well, there's problem in science, there's bias in science, so I'm just not going to listen to science. I'm going to listen to this other guy who probably has even worse incentives.
It's sort of very, it's endlessly frustrating, I would say. One of the main things that people sort of come to often say, right, is sort of, and there's sort of two ways I kind of want to take this. So the first thing is sort of, how do we generally know, like, how can we reasonably assume that science is a pretty correct way to get there? Like, how can we assume that what's sort of the argument for, okay, here's science, here's another way to get to the truth or get to what's right. How can we kind of know that science is a pretty damn good way to get there?
Yeah, I think ultimately the only way to really judge it in the broadest sense is that it produces information that is functional and useful in the real world.
Hmm.
So, if science were producing this huge body of information, but that information had, was not changing anything about our lives, was not giving us more power over ourselves and the world, then I think it would be absolutely rational to question whether science itself was effective. But
Hmm.
I mean, look around us, like our lives are radically different than the lives of people 200 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, this interview we're conducting through these electronics, through cables, we're talking to each other with almost zero latency completely across the world.
Yeah.
I'm in Seattle, you're in New Zealand. I mean, that's incredible, right?
Hmm.
Like I can't even detect the latency in our conversation at all. This is all going through fiber optic cables, underwater, right? I mean,
it's
that's
fucking
insane.
it's magic that works, you know?
Yeah. And what is the general primary underlying principle of all this stuff that we have? It's the scientific method,
Hmm.
you know? So the scientific method gives us real reproducible knowledge about the natural world and gives us power to manipulate the natural world. And so the scientific method is literally the most powerful technology that humans have ever invented. I
Hmm.
mean, it is just far and away the most powerful tool we've ever invented. And
Hmm.
so, and again, I think the evidence is all around us, and anyone from anywhere they're sitting can look around and see the evidence of that.
Yeah.
So, I think that is the measure by which we should judge the scientific method. But of course, the scientific method is a method, and it has to be applied by humans, and humans apply it imperfectly. So, I think scientific research is less efficient than it could be and less effective than it could be if we were perfect. But it still moves forward.
Hmm. I think we're not quite perfect yet, but we're aiming to get there, but we'll see. Um,
We're working toward it.
so one of the things that sort of people will commonly sort of say in terms of issues of science is sort of issues with funding, and that's sort of people who I find these people commonly haven't read the studies, they commonly haven't looked at certain things, or it'll be certain, like for instance, Netflix documentaries that will say, blah blah, the industry is funding this, therefore it is biased. Do you find, do you feel as though that's actually much of an issue? Do you think is it's commonly does that occur? Does that bias stuff frequently, or do you think it's so rarely the case? And when I'm talking about this, I mean commonly in terms of the whole. So we have this kind of thesis of like, okay, calories control weight loss and gain, but obviously it's more complex than just saying that. But it's like what influences those changes in calorie intake and expenditure. But we know that we sort of want to start from the basis of calories control weight loss and gain, and then we go and figure out why that's changed. Would that sort of be a, would you generally agree with that kind of premise?
All right, so let me make sure I understand what the question is here. Is this a question about industry influence, or is
Industry,
this
yeah, yeah, yeah. And then sort of just, so in terms of like, so you have generally scientists like yourself who sort of believe the more, they basically don't believe in the insulin hypothesis. Basically they're sort of more along the lines of, here's obesity, this is why we think it's caused, and then you sort of generally have your hypothesis to this, and then people will commonly, sort of some of the common arguments against positions like yours will be sort of, okay, well, but what about the sugar industry, or what about
Oh, yeah,
blah
okay.
blah, and it's kind of,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
So I'll answer that in a general sense, and then I'll answer it specifically with respect to that issue. So in a general sense, I think there's no doubt that the industry does impact research funding and research output, and I think there are many examples of that that has been documented, including the food industry. It's been documented. Well, it's funny. Right now, all the hate is on sugar, and so everyone's like documenting the insidious ways the sugar industry has manipulated research. But actually the meat and dairy industry, people don't talk about this as much because that's like okay food right now, in terms of like popular culture, at least in the United States. I don't know how it is in New Zealand. But people don't talk about it. But I mean, they also have, insidiously tried to impact research. So, I mean, this happens basically any industry that has the money to do it is doing it. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it does impact, but how much of an impact does it have over the overall research literature and its conclusions? I'm actually not sure about that. Sometimes people will say, like Marion Nestle, for example, a well-known researcher, well-known nutrition researcher, she'll point out that there's a strong correlation between funding source and the outcomes of the study. So, when the sugar industry funds sugar studies, those tend to have favorable outcomes for sugar. And the implication that people take away from that is, hey, these researchers, they know where the money is coming from, and so they bias the results to favor the sugar industry. But I don't think we can come to that conclusion, actually, because, I mean, think about it from the perspective of the sugar industry. You probably would want to fund studies that are types of studies that are more likely to yield actual findings that are favorable toward sugar, right? Like, so it's not necessarily that people are biasing the results. It could just be that lines of investigation that are already looking more favorable or less unfavorable toward sugar receive funding from that industry. And then the findings are actually just accurately reported, but they were, carefully selecting which lines of research they wanted to put their money into because they thought that those would make the industry look better. So, even without any kind of manipulation. So we can't really tell whether whether the researchers are doing something fishy or whether the research funding is just going into things that are more likely to look better for sugar without anything fishy happening. I tend to think it's more the latter, because, and that may not always have been the case, but I think in 2019, there are a lot more regulations around industry funding at reputable research institutions. So there's a lot more scrutiny. There's a lot more regulation. I think it's a lot harder to get away with being unscrupulous in terms of how you conduct your study and how you present, because you got a lot of eyeballs on you, and there's a lot of contracts that get signed about the industry not having the ability to impact how you write up the study and things like that. So that said, I mean, even just that can bias the literature as a whole. So even if the results are not being manipulated in any way, the fact that money is going into lines of research that tend to be more favorable toward, for example, sugar, that's going to yield ultimately an overall research literature that is more favorable toward sugar, even if those specific studies are completely honest. And so I think in that way it can bias the literature. But I mean, the degree to which that is really having an overall impact on things, I think is really hard to say. I know, and I don't want to dismiss it as a concern. I think it is a real concern that we need to think about. But I think on the other side of the spectrum, you have people who just kind of knee-jerk dismiss findings that they don't like because, if there's a finding they don't like, they look up the paper and the first thing they scroll down to is the conflict of interest statement. And then one of the researchers at some point got, had some interaction with some industry related to this, and they're like, oh, this is completely bogus. I don't want to believe it. But then when there's a study that yields something that they like to hear, they don't go looking in the conflicts of interest statement. So even though there may be conflicts of interest there as well. So, one great example of this is in Gary Taubes's book, The Case Against Sugar. He, really did a very detailed job of looking for conflicts of interest of the people who were saying that sugar wasn't a big deal. Fred Stair and some other people whose names I don't remember. back in the 60s and 70s who were receiving some money from the sugar industry, and they were writing up, editorials and things kind of saying sugar's not a big deal. We need to be worrying about saturated fat. But the hero of this book is John Yudkin, who was the Cassandra who was saying, no, it's really the sugar. The sugar's the bad thing. Fat's okay. But what the book doesn't reveal is that he probably had the most extensive conflicts of interest of anyone. He was really extensively funded by the meat and dairy industries and edible oil industries. And I think he was actually, like, himself personally was taking home a lot of money from that. So it wasn't just funding his research. If I recall correctly, he also was personally receiving substantial sums from these industries. So as far as I can tell, his conflicts of interest were worse than anybody else's. But the way the story is told, by focusing on the conflicts of interest of the guys who are getting paid by the sugar folks, it makes it seem like it's all about the sugar industry corrupting, the whole conversation. So that's the kind of, narrative that you can create if you want to, by focusing on one conflict of interest but not another.
I think it's really sort of cool to hear that, because it's kind of like, well, in reality, it's very easy to paint a picture of how you'd like to paint it, really. It's like, for instance, something that I think is quite cool, and it was really cool to see you go on Joe Rogan, because it's like, commonly, I think this is why you actually went on, it's like he'd had a lot of conversations around keto, but no conversations sort of with someone on the other end saying, hey, but here's some other sort of points. And I think, like, yeah, I don't think Joe's aiming to be like the best nutrition podcast in the world. And like, I don't think that's his goal, but it's like, I think it was really cool to see. It's like he had someone on and it was sort of like reasonably unbiased. He let you speak. It was really, really cool. And it's kind of like, it's nice to see that we're kind of coming a bit more sort of to the place where we're not so one-minded. We're not so like intense. Like, for instance, on saturated fat, it's like we're kind of now understanding a little bit more nuance about it, or like, maybe even if researchers understood it, now the sort of general public is kind of understanding a little bit more. Like, I still fully don't understand all the mechanisms and sort of when it's good, when it's bad, but it's cool to see now that we had the whole calories in, calories out crowd go really, really, really hard on just, you can eat whatever you want any time of the day, as long as your calories and macros, sort of all that. And it's kind of sort of coming a bit sort of full circle now. We're kind of thinking like, well, you might be better off eating more sort of like whole food. Just in general, it's probably a better idea. And if you're obese, it's probably a better idea to eat more sort of whole food. And it's cool to sort of see how these things generally are tending to come full circle. In terms of these things, when you're sort of having conversations around these, in terms of like, say for instance, when we're on Joe Rogan, you're sort of having that debate, how do you sort of feel as though you should go about approaching these conversations? Because, say for instance, if I have a conversation, I'm at my university and one of my lecturers says, I don't think calories in, calories out controls weight loss, I'm sort of sitting there like, whoa, why is that? I try and question them. The way I approached it at the time wasn't that good. I just kind of got a little mad, angry little 20-year-old getting mad about about what I think is the way the world works. And it's I think it's very hard to approach these conversations intelligently. And like, I don't know if you've read it's always a joke when I bring this book up now. I've brung this book up literally a million times. Have you read Ego is the Enemy by Ryan Holiday? No, it's a very good book, but effectively it's like we all get this is not the premise of the book, but it's effectively like we all have these egos and we all always think we're extremely correct and we think we know more than the other person in the debate. How do you personally sort of go about, when you're in a debate, how do you think it's best in a debate, or you sort of get into a conversation in everyday life about this kind of stuff? How do you go about sort of navigating that? Because I find it really, really difficult, because, egotistical 20-year-old, really hard, because you think you know everything. And
yeah. I mean, honestly, I don't think I handled it as well as I could have on the Joe Rogan show. I got a lot of negative feedback from that, as well as a lot of positive, but I think a lot of people felt that I was arrogant in my approach. And so, and it was funny because I had no like awareness of that during the debate. But I can see where people are coming from after the fact. I think, basically for me, I had prepared extensively. I had been preparing for months. I don't know if you saw on my blog, I had a list of like 50 some references.
Very
okay, cool. And so I was so prepared for that debate. And because of that, I was supremely confident. And, particularly when you're debating someone who, doesn't really have a handle on the issues. Like, honestly, it's like climate change scientists debating a climate change denier. Like, the facts are on your side, way more about it than they do.
Yeah.
So, and you're supremely confident. And that's how I felt when I went into that. And by the way, I don't think I know everything. I don't think everything that I know is right. But, based on my extensive interactions with Gary and my extensive interactions with the scientific literature and my own research, I do feel very confident, at least on certain points, that, my position on things is more evidence-based. And so that was kind of how I came into it. And I think because of that, I kind of had a dismissive attitude with him, which turned a lot of people off. So I honestly, I don't think I handled it as well as I could have. I think if I could go back, I would do it a little differently. Part of the problem, I think, is that he was interrupting me a lot. And I knew that going into it. I knew he was going to do that because I spoke with Alan Aragon, who had debated him previously. And basically Alan didn't get a word in edgewise because Gary was constantly talking over him. And so I said, there's no way I'm going to let this happen to me. And so I was ready to defend my speaking time. And that's what I did. But basically, in retrospect, I think kind of he put me in a position where I had to be the bad guy by shutting him down every time he tried to interrupt me. Just to get my speaking time.
I was watching it yesterday, and I remember at the very start, you were still outlining your first position, and he was like, "I don't understand the method yet," and it had been 5 minutes or so, and it's like you're still outlining your whole point of view. I would generally agree. I think it's like you're put in a position where you have to be that aggressive because you're not trying to win an argument. You're trying to like show people what is true. Like you had this. I think you were put in that position. I don't think you were just being a dick. Like it's kind of like you're on this massive platform. Like he gets I think it's like 80 million views a month or some shit. Like it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
I think you kind of were put in that position, but I think it's really cool to see you reflecting on that.
Yeah, it was challenging in that respect. And, I reacted to it how I did. And I think it was effective in the sense that I did get my speaking time.
Yeah.
I was able to successfully fend off most of his interruptions. And by the way, like I wasn't trying to talk over him either, just to be clear. I absolutely respected his speaking time with very few exceptions. And I think he spoke for about the same amount of time that I did. So I was 100% willing to let him have equal speaking time. It wasn't about trying to dominate him. It was just about trying to be able to make my points. But I mean, that said, I think that I could have handled it more effectively. Like, I think the way that I did it was maybe a little too aggressive or domineering. And I think that probably contributed to turning people off. I probably could have done it in a better way than that, in a way that kind of didn't make me look like the bad guy as much. And yeah, just like other things that I think were more like just kind of turn people off was like when he would say something that I felt was pretty ridiculous, like, focusing on anecdotes about some 400-pound guy he knows, or him and his brother eating, quote, as much as humanly possible and weighing different amounts. I'm just like,
wow.
I'm smiling like I am now. I would like smile or snicker or something. That. I'm like, this is so ridiculous.
This is not.
Do I really have to take this seriously? Yeah. Do I really have to take this seriously? But I think the audience did want me to take it seriously. I think that's the response I got, is they did want me to take it seriously. And so, at the end of the day, the way my perspective on that debate was very instrumental. I'm
Mm.
not there to satisfy my own ego. I'm not there to do anything other than try to educate the audience. And
Mm.
so ultimately, I think the way that I delivered it alienated some of those people. And in that sense, it was not as effective as it could have been. So
Mm.
I think, so that's kind of my perspective. Other thing is, it's just very difficult. I mean, Gary and I have a long history of criticizing one another, and there's just a lot built up there. And so, it was a stressful and contentious situation. And under that kind of scenario, it's really hard to go deeper and make, really go deeper and keep perspective on what you're trying to say.
Yeah.
So, I really would have loved to spend more time, not just on what's wrong with his ideas, but what is right about my ideas.
Mm.
And we didn't really have much time to do that.
Mm.
I wanted to talk about insulin resistance, not just obesity.
Mm.
And we didn't have time to do that. And, I think in the end, what would have helped a lot would be to have a debate structure. So we tried to, my idea was to have a little bit of structure. So the reason I talked for so long in the beginning, and I think I was too long-winded, but the reason that I did that is because we had agreed, the three of us in advance, that we would each present our model first, and then we would get into the debate. So, one of us would explain his model, then the other one would explain his model without interruption, and then we would get into the debate. And we had all agreed to that, including Joe, but he didn't implement that when we went into the debate. And so it was kind of just immediate free-for-all brawl, which I think, people were just like confused about what we were even arguing about. I think that was part of the issue. And so I think, and if I had had my druthers, we would have had more debate structure even than that. That was like me saying, this is the minimum amount of debate structure that I can deal with. Because I thought that I couldn't ask Joe to have a more extensive debate structure. I just didn't think he would do it.
Yeah.
And so if I really had my way, it would have been much more structured, where each of us had blocks of speaking time to address certain topics and to respond to one another. And that way we could be really thoughtful and go into depth on whatever we wanted to, and, really lay out arguments and explain our position, instead of, constantly trying to parry each other like in a, fencing match. And so I think, that right there would have made a huge difference. I think that would have made more of a difference than any kind of, me trying to modify the way that I deliver, et cetera. But I think one other last thing that I'll add is that, a lot of people have remarked that I kept my cool, even, though it was a stressful situation. And that's true. I did. I was not flustered. I was very confident. And that was the reason for that. The way I achieved that was by extensive preparation. So that's the same way that I can be confident when I give talks. I am doing extensive preparation. I'm gathering together all the pertinent literature. I'm reading the papers. I'm pulling out data. I have numbers on the tip of my tongue. In this case, I went even further, and I had a reference list that I could call out numbers to on my website. So I was supremely prepared for that debate. And that is what gave me the confidence, and perhaps even, overconfidence that manifested as arrogance to some people, that I had in that debate.
Yeah, I think you were kind of in quite a precarious position, because no matter what you did, I think you were, like, Joe's audience, I think, regardless, was going to be sort of more on the other side generally. And I think you had to, it was kind of like an uphill battle. But I think regardless, it's like there's not many conversations on, like, I do love Joe's podcast. It is a fantastic podcast. He's an insanely good interviewer. I don't think he sort of aims specifically for the most true statement all the time. but it's like I think he does a pretty damn good job of it compared to most people, and he's willing to have conversations that people don't have.
Yeah, it was cool. It was cool for him to have me on. And oh yeah, lost my train of thought.
Yeah.
Anyway, go on.
I think for him to sort of take like, okay, here's one of the most reputable people on the other side, and like host them and sort of let them talk and like actually sort of do that, I think was very, very cool. And yeah, it's like I've had a few debates on here where I've sort of hosted them, and sort of it's been, I think there's less pressure because there's less people watching, and there's not as much like, for instance, one of the debates I had a while ago was sort of on for hypertrophy, training to complete failure versus training leaving some reps in reserve. And it was really, really good. It's like they handled each other so fantastically. They were both really reasonable, rational. Everyone was honest. Everyone was nice. It was polite. Like it was really, really cool. But I think you guys were in a position where there's so much sort of, it felt like there was so much weighing on it. And it's like, it's live. Everyone's watching. You're in this studio in LA or something.
Well, I mean, it's more than just that. It's the backstory. I mean, Gary has been essentially painting my entire field of research as a bunch of idiots for 10 years and has been doing it from this massive media platform that he has. And so it's not just that he's been promoting, like, I would say, very wrong ideas, not to say that all of them are wrong, but some of them are very wrong and wrong-headed. But he also has been really like portraying the research community and public health authorities as a bunch of bumbling idiots, based on a really biased telling of the history and the evidence. And so that is kind of the backstory. And then on my end, I've been very critical of him. I've, tried to be very frank about pointing out what I see about the shortcomings in his arguments and his reasoning process. And he's obviously quite unhappy about that. And so I think that, and not only that, I mean, I think the writing that I've done has ultimately had a big impact on the way people see this stuff. Like, it's I think it has drawn a lot of people back away from his writing and from viewing him as a credible source. And so I think that, so that was basically the situation where he's like, his position relies on trying to undermine the credibility of me and my entire field. And my position undermines his credibility. So it's like, I think that was kind of the thing that set up the bare knuckle nature of it.
Well, it's kind of like everything you've done sort of has sort of been like, okay, I'm trying to find, and it's like, okay, say if I look from an outside point of view and I view both your positions as equally charitable, you could assume that both people they've just had different interpretations of the research. And it's like, man, like we have this fucking epidemic of obesity and diabetes. And it's just like, okay, it's frustrating for someone like myself, because you look at it and I'm like, okay, I haven't got like a master's or even a PhD in this. It's like, for me to look at these two insanely intelligent people who've done their research, they've literally spent their whole lives trying to get this shit right, and they completely disagree. It's like, it's honestly, it's like, okay, then how do people know who to believe? It's really, it's like, fuck, man.
I agree. It's very tough for people, in a general audience setting. But I want to say that I could have debated almost anyone else and had, a very nice, respectful conversation. Because to me, the thing that pisses me off more than anything else is evidence abuse. So someone who manipulates evidence to achieve some kind of, desired outcome. And I see a lot of that from Gary. I see extensive evidence, evidence of evidence abuse. And I cannot respect the person who does that. Now, someone who looks at the evidence and applies the scientific method in their reasoning process and comes to conclusions that a reasonable, knowledgeable person could come to, and doesn't go calling, everybody idiots in a particular field, that's somebody I can have a conversation with and a debate with. But like someone who's just like trying to burn the house down, and I don't know what his objectives are, but
yeah,
like that's just not a situation that sets up, a positive interaction for me.
yeah.
And so, yeah. So, but I mean, how do you tell if you're, someone from a general audience, if you're not an expert? I mean, I think the first thing you can look at is what is the training and experience of these two people. So just in our example, I have 12 years of scientific research experience. Some of that is in the obesity research field. All of it's in the neuroscience field. And that's my area of expertise. That's what I talk about the most. Gary has a background in physics and journalism. He has never done any experiments in obesity research. To my knowledge, he's never done any experiments in the biological sciences at all. So, I mean, I think that right there should be a pretty strong clue that when he's trying to tear down the entire edifice of, obesity research, that maybe you should take a step back and say, maybe I should be skeptical of this.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's kind of like how I've kind of come to my conclusions of who I should have on the podcast, who I should try to give a voice to. It's like these people are usually not speaking in absolutes. They're usually speaking sort of very in sort of with context a lot of the time. And they're usually open to critiquing their own ideas. They're open to criticism. It's like, do you know Mike Israetel?
I know the name. I don't know much about him.
So he's a very very good hypertrophy sort of researcher and sort of, I guess you would call educator. And one of the things he did is he literally critiqued his own intellectual flaws. Like he just, and I've talked about this extensively with him, and it's really cool. It's sort of like, okay, here's what I do wrong as an intellectual. And it was like, wow, you get to see, here's the times when I make an idea bigger than it actually is, or I conflate things that are primarily anecdote or just sort of observations lumped together or something. It's very, it was.
Yeah, absolutely. Capacity for self-critique, the capacity to change one's mind. Those are very important markers of rationality. And yeah, I think those are some of the signs that you can look for when you're trying to suss these things out before investing yourself in a certain philosophy.
Yeah. I don't know, do we have time or not? I would love to sort of touch on, because it's just something that I'm absolutely fascinated by. Do you sort of have a general, so obviously I would say we have a generally good idea of why obesity occurs now. Do you think we have a similar kind of same idea for diabetes, or do you think it's still confused, or do you think we're still kind of trying to figure out the mess that is that?
Honestly, I think we have the clearest idea for diabetes that we have for perhaps any chronic lifestyle disease. Diabetes, I mean, and I don't want to oversimplify it. There's probably a lot of things that go into it, but the primary causes of diabetes, as far as I can tell pretty clearly, are excess energy intake, excess calorie intake, or really excess body fatness would be a different way to put it. So excess body fatness, insufficient physical activity, and genetics. So, and only 2 of those can be modified, of course. What's that?
Do you find people, because people will commonly sort of respond to that with saying, but not all diabetics are obese. But then it's like what I've been really looking at. So like all these research papers that I've got on my desk are generally relating to sort of hypertrophy and resistance training and body composition and diabetes. And it's kind of like commonly the thing you'll see is if they are relatively smaller individuals with diabetes, their lifestyle's still not in order. They might not be heavily obese, but it's like that they have low levels of muscle mass. They don't exercise that much. They might have other sort of risk factors that lead to comorbidities.
Yeah. So here's the thing is that excess body fatness is a risk factor. It's not an all or nothing thing. As I said, there are 3 primary causes. It's not all about excess body fatness. And so, if you find someone who's lean and develops diabetes or type 2 just to be clear, I'm talking specifically about type 2 diabetes,
Mm.
which is the type that typically, not always, develops in adulthood and involves insulin resistance. Finding a person, or even, a percentage of people with type 2 diabetes that were lean going into it, that doesn't mean that excess body fatness is not a risk factor. What you do to determine if something is a risk factor is you say, do people who start off fatter have a higher risk than people who start off leaner? And the answer is yes. There is an extraordinarily strong relationship between body fatness and risk of diabetes. So in one study, people in the lowest category of body mass index compared to those in the highest category, those in the highest category had a 42-fold higher risk of developing type 2 diabetes. And body mass index isn't even that great of a measure of body fatness. So it's a major risk factor. There's no doubt about that. It's been shown by study after study after study. And more importantly, this is a thing that I want everyone to understand, because there's better evidence on this than there is on almost anything else. We have multiple large, well-conducted, randomized controlled trials that went on for multiple years, showing that diet and lifestyle interventions aimed at reducing calorie intake, increasing physical activity, and producing weight loss greatly reduce the risk of developing type 2 diabetes in people who do not currently have it. So these are studies. They're not just measuring biomarkers. The outcome is actual literal development of type 2 diabetes that they are measuring. Years-long studies in thousands of people, randomized controlled trials, and they're showing reductions of diabetes risk of 50 to 75% from these really modest interventions, like the DPP study, for example, Diabetes Prevention Program study. People lost like 12 or 15 pounds, something in that range. And maybe it was even less than that. I don't remember exactly, but they did this really modest diet and exercise intervention. A lot of people didn't even comply that well. And at the end of 2.8 years, there was a 58% reduction in the risk of developing diabetes.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's been shown and that was done with a low calorie, low fat diet plus exercise. This is exactly the thing that people like Gary Taub says doesn't work. Well, guess what? We have huge randomized controlled trials demonstrating that it definitely does work.
Yeah.
We have also studies, some people would say like, hey, maybe they're just actually eating less carbohydrate and it really is all about the carbs. We have studies using a drug called, gosh, I'm forgetting the name of the drug right now.
It's not like one of the classic diabetes ones, is it?
No, it's a drug that impairs fat digestion in the small intestine. So it causes you to poop out about 30% of the fat that you eat. And orlistat, is that right? Anyway, it inhibits one of your digestive enzymes. And guess what? If you give that to people in double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized controlled trials, that prevents diabetes too. Wow. So reducing fat absorption prevents diabetes. Acarbose reduces carbohydrate absorption. That reduces diabetes in placebo-controlled, randomized controlled trials. Just doing aerobic exercise does it. Just doing resistance exercise does it. So basically anything you do that affects energy balance, that makes energy leave your body at a greater rate or makes it enter your body at a slower rate, has a profound effect on type 2 diabetes risk. And this is in people who are already on the verge of diabetes. These people have pre-diabetes. So, I mean, imagine if you had someone doing this for their entire lives from the point, starting from a healthy place. Like, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the diabetes nut is cracked. We have solved this largely. I mean, I'm sure it's more complicated. I'm sure there's other things that matter, but those things seem to be the heart of it. That's really the core of it.
Yeah. I think in terms of prevention, it's like, well, there's some pretty good ideas of what you should do. It's like eat a little bit better, exercise a little bit more. And it's like, yeah, that's easier said than done. But it's like, we know those things fucking work. Like, I think I read a study where it was like a 1% increase in muscle mass, which I used to be 50 kilos. Now I'm 74, still relatively lean. Most of that gain was muscle mass. And that, I don't know what as a percentage that is gained, but gaining the first 10 kilos wasn't hard at all. So it's like 1% muscle mass. It's like, say if you're a 70 kilo individual, that's like 0.7 of a kilo or something like that. It's like ridiculously small. And that over 1 year reduced it by 20% or something. It's like, and the protocol for resistance training was pretty bad too. Like it wasn't that good of a protocol. It was just like, geez, like.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the impacts are huge. Like you don't see impacts this large in obesity prevention or in cardiovascular disease prevention through lifestyle. Like these kinds of effects supported by large multi-year rigorous randomized controlled trials are almost unheard of. And here we have like a whole pile of them all pointing in the same direction. I mean, this to me is really extraordinary. When I found this out, I was like, oh my God, how do more people not know about this? And not only that, there are even randomized trials now showing you can reverse diabetes by causing people to lose weight. The direct trial, for example, is the best demonstration of that. You put people on a very low calorie diet for a certain period of time, and then you transition them back to a regular diet and you try to get them to maintain the loss. And then 1 year later, after they've been eating a regular diet for a long time, a high proportion of those people don't have diabetes anymore. Like you can give them a glucose drink and test their glucose tolerance and it's normal. They don't have diabetes. And so, and if you look at people who were able to lose and maintain the most weight, I think it was like 86% of them reversed their type 2 diabetes. So, I mean, we're talking about extraordinary effects. I mean, not just prevention, but even reversal. So yeah, I mean, to me, this just blows everything out of the water. Everything else, every other explanation is just gone.
This to me is like so I used to be obviously very, very hard into bodybuilding, and I do still love bodybuilding, but it's like you look at this and it's like the tiny like implication, the tiny amount of change you have to make in someone's like muscle mass or just dietary habits. It's like it makes bodybuilding look very, very boring. Like, okay, cool, you can increase someone's biceps by like increase the size of that by like 1% more. I don't really give a shit. Like if you can prevent diabetes, like, gee, you could basically save the world. Like, you know, it's just like I can't think of many problems that are bigger than like obesity and health. And it's just like
if you're preventing diabetes, you're having a lot of other effects on other aspects of health and well-being. I mean, that's going to radiate out into risk of other diseases like cardiovascular disease and perhaps dementia. It's probably going to support better cognitive abilities, better sleep. I mean, you're going to have better physical performance. It's probably going to radiate out in many beneficial ways in your life.
Because I think 90% of people with diabetes, type 2 diabetes, have a comorbidity. I think something like that. It's a very high percentage. And then I think 80-something% have 2 or more. And it's like, wow, you know, like that's intense. And, you know, and it's like you look at the correlation between mental health issues and long-term conditions or diabetes. And it's just like, okay, like, geez, if we can solve that, it's a massive thing. Like it's not this minor thing that just a small percentage of the population has. Like it's like 9% of the US or something.
It's more than that. Yeah, it's above 10.
Wow.
Yeah, it's enormous. Yeah. And I mean, and depending on what demographic you look at, it can be even higher. You know, if you look at older adults, it's quite a bit higher than that. It's really pretty extraordinary. I mean, the average American, by the time you get, and I think this is probably true to a lesser extent for any industrialized nation, once people get to 50, 60, 70 years old, the average person is looking pre-diabetic, if not diabetic, if you give them an oral glucose tolerance test.
Mm.
So, I mean, basically, if you're just going with the flow, you're going to be seriously metabolically screwed up by the time you're middle and older age in a country like the US.
Yeah. And I think even like you look at New Zealand, right, and you think generally, oh, like, well, we're pretty healthy, pretty like green country. Everyone's pretty like fitness, or everyone lives on farms or whatever. But it's like, aren't we like third in the world for obesity or something? Like we're pretty bad.
I don't know. Do you know what the percentage is?
I think it's pretty high though, and it's not. It's like I feel as though living here, we think we're sort of guarded from this stuff and health isn't that bad, but it's like you look at the like rates of diabetes in New Zealand and it's pretty damn bad. It's like obviously studying podiatry, it's like I get to see a lot of diabetic ulcers, I get to see a lot of amputations, I get a lot of see of like the really downstream effects of this stuff, and it's like, yeah, you kind of realize that this is why I don't want to be a podiatrist. It's like, wow, diabetes is fucked. I don't want to solve it 8 steps down the line. I want to try and solve it like at the start.
Right.
It's like,
right.
It's just,
yeah. And another thing that I think that helps with gaining perspective on this is to look at non-industrial cultures, because, you know, even if the rate is lower in some countries, it's probably lower in New Zealand than in the US. Probably, you know, it's lower in France, it's lower in Italy. Cultures that have better health than in the US and lower body fatness. But I mean, even those countries have massively higher rates than non-industrial cultures. I mean, if you look at the studies that have been done in cultures that are subsistence farmers or hunter-gatherers, there's basically no diabetes. I mean, you really like can be hard pressed to even find a single person with diabetes in those cultures. And yeah, I mean, even if you do it in an age-adjusted way, because some people might say, oh, well, they're dying too young. Even if you look at it age-adjusted, the rates are just like strikingly low to the point of being literally non-existent in a lot of places. And, you know, they're like, for example, the island of Catava, which Stephan Lindeberg studied hundreds of people on that island. Not only did he not find a single person with diabetes, this is an island in Melanesia where they're subsistence farmers. Not only is there a single person with diabetes that he identified, but none of these people were even close to diabetes. I mean, they weren't even headed in that direction. They had excellent metabolic health. And the only 2 overweight people that he found on that entire island were people who actually lived off island in a city and were just there to visit. So, I mean, that to me is the human ancestral template. And that is, you know, just to be dramatic about my language, I think that's our birthright that we can claim with the right diet and lifestyle. And that's not what we are claiming in in all industrialized countries.
Yeah. I think it's like technology is kind of, I think it's gone way too fast for us to handle. And it's like, we're sitting here with all this technology, no matter what area you look at, like people talk about social media a lot and all that. And it's like, literally any area of technology we cannot handle, and it's like, well, there's beginning to be negative effects of us not being able to handle it. It's just like this moves way faster than our biology does.
Absolutely. It's called an evolutionary mismatch. That's the concept.
Shit.
Basically, the conditions that our genome is evolved for are no longer present, and there's a mismatch there with how we're calibrated. And I mean, I think that's exactly the concept that underlies obesity and type 2 diabetes. If you let natural selection run its course for a couple million years, maybe we would thrive on junk food, you know? I think that's totally conceivable. I mean, there are people in the modern US who don't watch what they eat at all, and they don't gain weight. They don't, they stay fit and healthy. They're a minority. Okay.
Yeah.
They're go ahead.
Like I eat like I weigh 74 kilos, right? And I eat 4,500 calories a day ish, which is ridiculous, right? Like it's just, my expenditure is for some reason just through the damn roof. And like, I'm pretty meticulous with tracking, and it's just like, what? It's really strange, but it's like those people exist because I'm one of them. But it's like, then there's also people who eat not that much and then they gain weight. It's crazy.
Yeah. So, I mean, generally there is a correlation between body weight and calorie intake. So it's pretty rare that you'll find, I think it's more than rare that you'll find someone who actually has obesity that has a lower calorie intake than a lean person of the same, basic body structure. But yeah, I mean, there are some people, for whatever reason, they can eat junk food and they just won't overeat it, or they'll burn it off, or, do whatever, and they don't get fat and they stay healthy. So, I mean, the genes are there in some people. It's theoretically possible that, that everyone could be like that at some point in the future, but we're definitely not there yet. Right now, we are people who are adapted to an environment where food is hard to get, where we have a habitually high physical activity level, where women are, giving birth a lot and nursing a lot. And that's what our bodies and brains are adapted to. And we thrust ourselves into this environment, which in many ways is way better. But there are certainly some downsides. And one of them is that it pushes us to eat too much.
Yeah, I think it's kind of, yeah. So effectively what you're saying is that in the future, I'll be the genetic elite and I'll just sort of work really, really well. My children will just be insanely healthy.
You'll be the king of New Zealand.
I'm very, very glad to hear that. I've kept you for a little bit longer than you bargained for. Shall we end it off here? Where can people find you, and where can people find more information around Red Pen Reviews, and sort of where also can they find your book?
Yeah, so I'm most active on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @WHSource. My personal website is stephanguyenet.com. I have some stuff on there, but I haven't been very active on there lately. My book is The Hungry Brain. It's available pretty much every major bookseller, including Amazon. And Red Pen Reviews is at redpenreviews.org. And I definitely encourage people to check that out. If you want to, if you find that concept interesting, please check it out. If you want to support what we do, please donate. That is really going to be important to supporting our mission as we move forward with that organization. And also, if you have a master's degree or higher, good critical thinking skills and good general audience writing skills, apply to be a reviewer, because we're always looking for new reviewers.
Hey guys, thank you very much for listening to this episode. I hope you give us a review or you really enjoyed the episode. Let me know any feedback. I'm always open to any criticism, anything like that. Reach out to me on Instagram at James_Walsham. Or if you'd like to follow my business account, follow at the Hypertrophy Hub. Thank you guys so much for listening. If you would like to help the show, there's a list of ways to do so in the show notes, but if you're wondering how, the best thing to do is just give us a review on iTunes, or just let me know how the show can be improved. Thank you very much.